No nos gusta la basura espacial y no podemos barrerla debajo de ninguna alfombra. Es cierto que cada vez hay más lanzamientos, es cierto que la industria crece y que estamos muy acostumbrados al uso de imágenes satelitales, estamos acostumbrados al GPS, a chequear cómo va a estar el clima y ni hablar de las industrias que trabajan con toda esta información que nos llega desde el espacio, ni hablar de mitigar el cambio climático. Hasta ahí todo bien. El tema es que la basura se sigue acumulando y hay que hacer algo al respecto para que la humanidad pueda establecer una economía espacial que sea sustentable y sostenible en el tiempo. Para entender un poco más sobre cómo viene el panorama, que viene medio complicado, pude hablar con Manuel Metz. Él es el secretario del Comité Interinstitucional de Coordinación en materia de desechos espaciales. En este momento Manuel está en Alemania, pero trabajan codo a codo con las agencias espaciales más importantes del mundo, como sea la NASA, la Agencia Espacial Europea, la Agencia Espacial China, la de la India, la de Japón, por nombrar algunas. No se pierdan esta entrevista. Hi, Manuel. Thank you very much for joining Tendencia del Espacio. Well, the first question is, how is the space debris scenario looking in 2024?
Absolutely. So we have seen an immense number of launches of satellite being deployed into low Earth orbit specifically. And that's most of the satellites that have been deployed in the recent years are rather small satellites. So either CubeSats, really small, tiny satellites, or small constellation satellites. So the number of launches, the numbers of spacecraft deployed into orbit has dramatically increased in recent years. So currently we have about 20,000 satellites in total that have been brought into orbit, and out of these are 10,000 still functioning. That's an immense number. Some 10 years ago, we had about 1,000 functioning satellites in orbit. And of course, that also raises the issue and it raises more questions about space debris. We know we already have space debris in orbit basically since the beginning of human spaceflight. We have space debris in orbit, and the amount of space debris is increasing. And that means both intact objects like derelict satellites or upper stages, but also fragments. And of course, the immense number now that we have in orbit raises the question whether the number of space debris continues to increase more and more, and we have a kind of an self-increasing effect, so that space debris collides with satellites and creates even more spacecraft, even if we would not launch any more.
Okay, so we could say that the main concern are the accidents that already occur between satellites in space, besides pollution?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the concerns is that debris collides with other debris, with derelict spacecraft or upper stages, and creates more debris. And of course, also because of the large number of spacecraft, it also means that operators of spacecraft have to perform more and more collision avoidance maneuvers. By that we mean that you try to detect in advance potential risky situations where satellites could collide with space debris or with other satellites and try to avoid that. And also that, of course, now increases, so the amount of collision avoidance maneuvers that are necessary. Also that has, of course, increased.
Okay, but we are talking about things that happen around the Earth, but how do these situations of collisions and superpopulation of things around the Earth affect our daily life?
One aspect is, of course, that potentially active satellites contributing, for example, with Earth observation data to our knowledge about climate, about weather, but also in case of natural disasters, contributing to assess the situation. Those satellites, if they get hit by a large piece of space debris, they would be out of function, and we would not have any more of these kinds of services, or at least partially these services would not be available from that particular satellite. So that's one concern, of course. And that if we have more and more space debris, it could be more and more difficult to bring those valuable satellites into orbit. And the other concern is about re-entering objects. So objects re-enter into Earth's atmosphere after a while. And if you have large objects, the fragments could potentially reach the ground. So there's also a subtle, but still there is a risk related to re-entering objects.
And how does the IADC work with other countries, with the different space agencies around the world?
So the IADC, or stands for Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, a very long and complicated name. What it means is that scientists in space agencies in the 1980s, 1990s, they realized that space debris could be an issue. And they started to work together to assess the situation, to exchange research results, to issue and facilitate common research activities, but also to develop guidelines to mitigate the growth of space debris. And that's, even today, that's the main activities. So in the IADC, we have working groups dealing with specific issues on space debris, starting from observations, from modeling, from protection and mitigation. And in these research working groups, we have scientists contributing to the work of the IADC, doing joint research activities. And one of the main outputs of the IADC are the mitigation guidelines. So these are guidelines, if they are applied, then spacecraft can be built in a way that is more sustainable than without these guidelines.
Could you mention the most important guidelines that the IADC gives to the space agencies? Maybe, are there any guidelines that weren't used a few years ago?
I would say the general principles are still the same that have been agreed upon 20 years ago. So not to generate unnecessary fragments or release objects into space, to make sure that spacecraft after the end of life, after the end of mission, are passivated, so to avoid risk, for example, of explosion of fuel or batteries, rupturing of batteries, to limit the lifetime of objects in certain regions. So, for example, in the low Earth orbit regions, spacecraft have to re-enter Earth's atmosphere after 25 years, and that's something that is currently under the debate. For example, is 25 years still the right number, or do they have to re-enter into Earth's atmosphere quicker? So some people argue for 5 years, others for even lower than 5 years. So that's something which is currently really debated and discussed a lot in the frame of the IADC, but also in other fora as well.
And how do the private companies enter in this game of space exploration and guidelines for sustainable Earth orbit? Do you work with private companies?
I mean, private companies, or now put it the other way, the IADC guidelines are just guidelines. But because there is a scientific background and a scientific rationale for these guidelines, also for the numbers in the guidelines, many countries, many entities, even those who are not involved in the IADC, apply these guidelines because they know there's a scientific background behind these numbers. And one way that could be made applicable is, for example, like we do it in DLR Space Agency. So we take the IADC guidelines, put them into our product assurance guideline, and with that make them applicable for industry. So industry then has to respect these guidelines to prove that they comply with these guidelines if they, for example, are building a satellite, a national governmental satellite for Germany.
All these scientific data and space debris numbers that you mentioned before, where do they come from? They come from the agencies that work with the committee, with the IADC?
Exactly. So we have certain space agencies who have their own models, or for example, for DLR, in many cases, we have research entities. So we work closely together with the universities, with the research entities. They have their models. And in the IADC, we then compare the models coming from these research entities with those coming from other entities, from the other agencies, to make sure that that we understand that the models are consistent. So sometimes they give, of course, differences in the outcome, but at least we know they're consistent, and we know that the predictions that we make have a common ground that is validated by comparing these different models.
Okay, thanks. And now let's go to the subject that has been on the news a few weeks ago, that it's about, well, it's been on the news for a while, about a regulation. Now that we have a lot of deployments, and I read a few weeks ago that investigators and scientists are asking in the United States to regulate the amount of launch or of deployments. Would this help to reduce space debris, or to, to put some order in the situation?
Yeah. So, I mean, the question is on what to regulate, and there is already a regulation in place in many countries, including the United States or European countries, and mainly these regulations focus on making space activities as safe as possible and as sustainable as possible by, for example, making sure that industry, also private industry, have to apply space debris mitigation guidelines, or by making sure that they have to make sure that they are able to perform collisions avoidance. And I think that's the way of regulation that we will see more in the future. So typically what it's then called is, specifically if you talk about space collision avoidance maneuvers, to make sure that they have these kinds of services available, is typically called then space traffic management. So like you have air traffic management in the future, I would expect that we have some kind of space traffic management regime that everyone then has to comply with.
Great. And the last question, how far are we, because, well, the industry is growing and regulations are growing maybe parallel or as necessary. How far are we of having a sustainable industry, space industry, or development of humanity in, well, yes, in the near Earth orbit?
That's a difficult question indeed. I would say, in my opinion, in my view, space activities in general are currently at the margin of or at the edge of sustainability. So we have seen models in the past that already predicted that we have kind of a runaway effect in low Earth orbit. So that space debris colliding with other objects creates more and more space debris, and we have an exponential growth. These models, the predictions of these models show to be not exactly what we see in space in reality today. So there is still some uncertainty there. But whatever we do in the future, everyone, private industry, governmental entity, universities, research entities, we need to make sure to comply with space debris mitigation guidelines in a very, very strict manner. And that's, to me, is the most important part of future space activities.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Manuel.
You're welcome.